was there an attack in the Tonkin Gulf?
I believe it probably started with seabirds. There were two types of backgrounds for communist leaders. There were the ones whose basic formative experience had been the schools they'd attended, and there were the ones whose basic formative experience had been the prisons where they'd served long prison terms under the French. And Les Juan was one of the latter group. There is a bizarre tale that I am reasonably sure is true, that in the late 1960s, when Thieu was president in Saigon, Thieu sent an emissary to Washington for some high-level private negotiations with the Americans. When the emissary returned to Saigon and he was briefing President Thieu, there were only three people in the room: the emissary, President Thieu, and one very trusted advisor. There were two communists in the room. We were dominating the world in a way that nobody in the past had ever dominated. No, there had never been a world's dominant power like the United States, which meant we had our finger in almost every pie all around the world, which meant we were dealing with countries that we didn't know much about. Any normal country only fights wars in places it knows something about. The United States, as the world's dominant power, felt obliged to involve itself in places of which it was ignorant.
This episode of the podcast is a real treat for me. When I started making these compendium episodes, I didn't actually imagine that I would end up talking to historians about the subjects that I was covering in these episodes. You just don't really think about these things. You don't think about all the different ways that these things can branch out. And, I think back, it's very fun how this all came together. I was reaching out to my own history professors in college, asking them some of the questions that I was wrestling with getting into the Second Indochina War, the American War in Vietnam. And the response I got from a lot of them was, I could help you, but to be honest with you, you should just reach out to Professor Moise at Clemson. And I said, okay, great, I'll reach out to him. And we talked via email for a couple months, me firing off, honestly, pretty ignorant questions, and Professor Moise patiently responding to me and helping flesh out some of these things that I was trying to, come to grips with. And I wrangled him into an interview at the end of all these email exchanges, and so that interview is what you're about to see here. This was an absolute treat for me because just to get the perspective of somebody who has contributed so much to thought about the Vietnam War and has written books about the Tet Offensive and about the Tonkin Gulf incidents, and also he's written books about China and is generally an expert on, the Vietnam War and then relations with Southeast Asia in general. So this is going to be a companion episode to Hell in a Small Place. If you think about it that way, it's just a more relaxed version of the same thing you'd get in Hell in a Small Place. And it's also just a chance for me to ask some of these questions that I've been wrestling with the entire time I've been creating these podcast episodes. So without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Professor Edwin Moise. Professor Moise, thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to.
I approached you because actually you were recommended to me. I was reaching out to some of my old college professors and they said, go find Professor Moise at Clemson. He's forgotten more than you will ever know about the Vietnam War. So,
well, I'm afraid they were speaking literally. I started forgetting stuff about the Vietnam War in 1963. So I've had a lot of time to forget it.
Oh man. So why the Vietnam War? Why is that? I think Vietnam and then Southeast Asia are your areas of expertise, but why those subjects specifically?
Well, the Vietnam War was the interesting thing that was going on when I was getting close enough to being an adult to start getting interested in interesting things. And Actually, there were two interesting things going on. It was Vietnam and China. And for a while, it looked like I was going to pick China as
Mm.
the main focus, but I've now shifted back to the Vietnam War.
Yeah, I think I saw you had written a book about China
Yep.
and geopolitics and things like that, which the thing that I think I've found so fascinating in studying this period is the geopolitics. It's the
Mhm.
perceived. I've almost thought of it as like if you'll forgive the Star Wars reference, like the Sith in the East, the combination of China and then the Soviet Union,
Mhm.
that communist bloc was just, it was seen as, oh, we're going to go into World War III, and if we poke that bear, that's what's going to do it. And yet
Mhm.
the bear continued to be poked. Break down for me in broad strokes kind of how the West and I guess the United States viewed that communist bloc and potentially what were the risks were, and why they stayed in Southeast Asia regardless.
Well, the mainstream of American opinion, the kind of people who had some influence, uh, wildly exaggerated the aggressiveness of the Chinese and Soviets. They had grown up dealing with Hitler and the Japanese militarists who were deeply abnormal. The people who didn't think Hitler was as dangerous as he was were simply being sensible. Hardly anybody is that dangerous. Nobody should be assumed to be that dangerous until they have shown themselves to be
Mm,
very unusual. Uh, have you ever thought about what happened uh, in the year 1941? Uh, by the beginning of the year, Hitler's effort to defeat Britain was visibly failing. And most people, if they are having trouble defeating the enemy they've got, do not think they need another enemy.
right,
But Hitler launches an invasion of the Soviet Union.
right.
And by the end of the year, his invasion of the Soviet Union is stumbling to a halt. And he declares war on the United States.
Yep.
The guy was batshit crazy. And if you think of that as the normal model of the evil dictator, which it isn't, you will wildly exaggerate the aggressiveness of whatever dictators you're currently dealing with.
Mm,
And uh, you look at Hitler, look at Stalin.
yeah.
The three biggest, nastiest wars that Stalin ever went into voluntarily, when it wasn't simply he'd been attacked, he has to fight, were against Poland after the Germans had already knocked most of the fight out of the Poles,
Hmm.
Finland, and Japan after the United States had already defeated Japan.
Right.
Uh, this is a guy who is very, very conservative about getting in fights. And if you look at him as a Hitler, you're kind of misunderstanding him.
Mm.
And we were looking at both the Soviets and the Chinese as much more Hitlerian than they were.
That is a fascinating point, one that I haven't come across before, but it's difficult too, because when you're trying to read about these things, you almost have to place yourself in the time in which these
Yeah.
decisions were made. And yet that's difficult because we have the
Mhm.
benefit of hindsight.
Yeah. Hmm.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And the Japanese are like militaristic to the nth degree, almost the
Yeah.
way they were. And it's almost like they're like you and me, only more so
Mhm.
the way they approach things.
They were stupidly aggressive.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. No, reading about the Pacific Theater,
Yeah.
I mean, it is suicidal is probably an understatement for some of the offensives and the things that they're putting together.
Yeah.
So because of how these dictators are viewed, because of how China and the Soviet
Yeah.
Union's viewed, there comes this idea in like the mid 1940s into the 50s, it really gets prominence, the domino theory, where instead of separating China and the Soviet Union and Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and all these places, instead of viewing them as they have their own goals and initiatives, they were viewed as like this giant bubble, and that they were going to operate with like a hive mind. It's funny, I was reading a Barbara Tuchman book the other day, and she wrote it in the 80s, and she said, it's 1983, ask me how it's turned out. Like, nothing's changed. But this idea, the domino theory, it's so prominent, and I guess when you view some of these countries as, when you lump in that they could be potentially incredibly aggressive, but then also operating together, as in there's some sort of loose confederation happening, that is very, very scary. But it proved to not necessarily be the case. So,
yeah, well, that was not as stupid. It
okay.
was thoroughly wrong, but it wasn't as silly as the wild exaggeration of the aggressiveness. Because traditionally, communist parties mostly had indeed been part of an international grouping with a single leader. The American Communist Party did not decide its own policies. Stalin decided its policies. The French Communist Party, Stalin decided its policies. And that was changing, and we were slow to figure out that it was changing. But assuming things are going to work the way they've worked in the past, there are lots of stupider things to do than that.
Yeah. So after the first war in Indochina, JFK comes in and he sort of changes how things are approached in Southeast Asia. He brings in a lot of analysts, a lot of people from the private sector. Explain to me just like how things start to change from Truman through Eisenhower to JFK, and kind of like how the United States decides they're going to approach Southeast Asia, because there is sort of a shift from 1954-ish to like the early 60s.
I would say the shift you're looking at in terms of JFK was initiated by the other side. You had, for a variety of reasons, the Vietnamese communists lying low and doing very little for a number of years. This allowed the United States to maintain the hope that the anti-communist forces were competitive with the communist forces in Vietnam. And the reality was the communists were enormously stronger, and they had not been using their strength for several years. And in 1959, they start very cautiously increasing their willingness to use their strength. And their inherent strength was so great that even a very tentative decision to use some of it was a very serious threat to the very weak government in South Vietnam. And Kennedy comes into office as things are going very badly for the South Vietnamese government we were supporting.
Yeah.
And he takes about a year and then decides, I can't let this country go communist, and I've got to send a bunch of Americans to save it from going communist. And it was communist success that triggered him. The policy that had worked well enough for years was not working. And he needed a different one with a lot more American personnel. And he goes from about 1,000 or so American military personnel in Vietnam when he's inaugurated to over 3,000 in a year and over 10,000 in another year.
Right.
In response to a dire situation. Given the domino theory, he didn't think he could not do that. And 3,000 or even 10,000, this was not a big, expensive operation.
Right. Yeah. One of the more interesting counterfactuals I've come across is people wondering how might things have looked different if JFK continued, if he remained alive. when you compare what Lyndon Johnson ended up doing when he comes into office, there's sort of even I was reading about he toured South Vietnam, and he has this very like black and white view for Southeast Asia, and it's a I don't even know how to describe it. There's like a force to what he's saying. It's very kind of like hard and fast. I don't know if he's pro. I don't know. He has a force of nature when he is describing things that is a little bit different. So how might things have changed if JFK were to continue?
Well, there's no way to tell, and something would surely have come out of left field,
Right.
which we could not now know what it would have been.
Right.
But I think JFK also saw things pretty black and white. And JFK was a lot more enthusiastic about military spending. Lyndon Johnson, what he wanted was to shift the U.S. government budget as much as possible away from the military to civilian side.
Yeah.
And JFK was much more comfortable with the idea of having a lot of the U.S. government spending go to the military side. And this is so extreme that Lyndon Johnson, in wartime, spent a smaller percentage of the U.S. government budget on the military than JFK had in peacetime. You look at the percentage of the government budget that is going to the military at the height of the Vietnam War,
Yeah.
and it's lower than it had been in peacetime under JFK.
Yeah, and I mean, I was reading about how Westmoreland is sending back, requests for more personnel, and it. I think all but one time it's, checked off good, but it's getting reviewed every single time, and it's frequent where Westmoreland's like, we need more, and he's kind of a little timid about it, even though publicly facing, he's very strong. He's got this kind of persona that is, I don't know, not pro-war necessarily, but
Westmoreland wanted more, and he didn't always get what he wanted, although this was kept from the public. The etiquette for a person in Westmoreland's position is you ask privately whether it would be okay to ask for more money. And you don't ask it publicly unless you've gotten a yes to the private question.
Yeah. Interesting. So you mentioned the South Vietnam government.
Yeah.
During the First War, the French are trying to create this government under Bao Dai, who's kind of like the hereditary ruler. He's very interesting, too. The sort of guy that's almost like the puppet you bring out and set on your mantelpiece, almost. So how powerful is a figure like Bao Dai? What is his role in things? Because even when Diem takes over, Bao Dai does have kind of this role in getting Diem the job.
Well, Bao Dai was not comfortable being a puppet. He deeply resented his lack of power and the fact that the French were not willing to give him real power. On the other hand, he had no talent for politics. And he was not able to take for himself power that a more skillful politician might have taken under the same circumstances. And I think it says a lot about Bao Dai that when he accepted the job of being officially the head of the government the French were creating, he did not choose to live in the capital city.
Right. Yeah.
Which means he's not able to attend a lot of crucial meetings. This is a guy who lacks a talent for power. The government he was made head of was structured very weak. The French had various Vietnamese who were in various ways on their side. And they thought that the ideal way of staying in control was have a guy with no talent for power politics as head of the government to ensure there will be no central leadership, no genuine leadership that needs to be taken seriously among the Vietnamese supporting France. If there had been somebody in particular who controlled them, that person would have been able to bargain with the French much more aggressively.
Yeah, if you have a non-communist Ho Chi Minh,
Yeah.
things probably look quite a bit different.
Yeah.
Diem is I can't remember off the top of my head the role he had in Bao Dai's government, but he has a high up role in Bao Dai's government.
He is only appointed prime minister of that government, and it's the first role he had in that government. He's only appointed prime minister at the very tail end, after
Right.
the fall of Dien Bien Phu.
Right.
And after the fall of Dien Bien Phu is really the tail end.
Yes.
And the job carries hardly any power when he is given it. As I say, there was no central leadership, and the various components of the structure mostly answer to Bao Dai or to the French rather than to the prime minister.
Right. So is Diem appointed because, he's Catholic? He's got like this, I don't know if it's a marketability that works with the West, but he appears fairly Western, even though being Vietnamese. Is he is it like a trial run per se for when he eventually gets tabbed by the United States, or is he just another member of an ineffectual government?
Nothing was working very well, and if there aren't any good choices, you sometimes find yourself making a less. Ziem also was not very good at power politics, but his brother New was good at power politics and knew wheeling and dealing and negotiating and bargaining.
Right.
Had a lot to do with Ziem getting picked for the job of prime minister.
When I was reading I think it was maybe the Pentagon Papers, a lot of the stuff that's being said in the lead up to Diem's downfall is about the news. It's not so much about Diem. It's about, we got to get rid of the news, or we got to, tame them. They're kind of running rampant in Saigon, and Diem is just, I guess, associated because New's his brother and so on and so forth.
Well, it was a very much family-centered operation.
Yeah.
For much of the time Ziem was running things, the two most powerful people under him were two of his brothers. I think the American hostility to New, I find it hard to decide what to think about it. If I'd been there, I'd have disliked him and he'd have disliked me. On the other hand, he had a talent for power politics. And they desperately needed somebody with a talent for power politics.
Right.
And there's a case to be made that he was just too much a problem, and there's a case to be made that a guy with a talent for power, you simply forget everything else and go with him. And I can't come up with which one should be considered the right way to think about it.
Yeah. So I guess the downside is, obviously you want to be on the right side of history in terms of, who was right, who was wrong sort of thing. New has an ability with politics, but the downside of New, and I guess also with Diem, is there's this like paranoia, a persecution of Buddhists, and just like not exactly savory individuals. Maybe more so New than Diem, but a little bit of both. They're sort of, it's not necessarily a reign of terror, but they are very, very in control and paranoid, and the communists have people everywhere. And so when you've got a paranoid group of people and communists everywhere, it gets a little bit fiery there in Saigon.
Yeah. Well, New was better than some of the people who came after him at trying to deal with the problem of communist infiltration of the Saigon government. New's secret police were a fairly serious threat to communist agents in the Saigon government, and I think there were more of them at higher levels after New was dead.
Yeah.
There is a bizarre tale that I am reasonably sure is true. In the late 1960s, when Thieu was president in Saigon, Thieu sent an emissary to Washington for some high-level private negotiations with the Americans. When the emissary returned to Saigon, and he was briefing President Thieu on his negotiations with the Americans, there were only 3 people in the room: the emissary, President Thieu, and one very trusted advisor to President Thieu. There were 2 communists in the room.
Wow.
The emissary and the trusted advisor.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen when New was running the secret police.
Right. Yeah, no, I've read that he stamped out communism quite, well, fairly effectively.
It's easier to stomp out communism when the communists are under orders not to defend themselves. And there was a period of years when the communists in South Vietnam were mostly told not to defend themselves. It's not a complete total, you may never defend yourself. But their ability to use violence, even in self-defense, was very narrowly constrained. And this made things easy for New. But even when the communists were fighting back, New was better than some of the people who... He was not nearly as successful after the communists started fighting back as he had been before. But he was still better than some of the people who came after him.
Is this order to stand down kind of a reconciliation tactic with the people, or is it a bit more political than that?
There were 2 aspects of it. One was pressure from China and the Soviet Union. And China and the Soviet Union had the experience of having the communist leader in North Korea, Kim Il-sung, get ambitiously aggressive and triggering a war which was very expensive for China, although not so bad for the Soviet Union. Cost to China of the Korean War was very high. They didn't want a war in Vietnam. There was pressure from China and the Soviet Union not to heat things up too badly in Vietnam. And the other aspect of it was that after North and South were split in 1954, the next 2 years, communist policy in the North was extraordinarily stupid and self-destructive. It's not just that they shot themselves in the foot. They switched the selector to full automatic fire and burned the trigger.
Yeah.
And they made a god-awful mess. And they were the next couple of years busy enough cleaning up the mess they had made, really not to want to be distracted by something going on in South Vietnam.
This mess you're referring to is sort of this flip of land ownership and execution of people and all sorts of things.
It is land reform, but it is combined with a raving paranoid purge of the Communist Party.
Yeah.
You're taking land away from the landlords, distributing it to the peasants, and you're asking yourself, why are we not doing this until now? And the answer they came up with was because the Communist Party has been massively infiltrated by enemy agents. And we need to go through the Communist Party exposing all the enemy infiltrators. I like to compare it with McCarthyism in the United States, where Joe McCarthy was wildly exaggerating communist infiltration of the United States government. The difference is that the United States was basically a democracy. So even when the government goes into a paranoid frenzy, you have a total of 2 people executed during the McCarthy era, both of whom were actual communist agents. You have a government which on its good days is a dictatorship. When it goes into an idiot paranoid frenzy, things get very, very ugly.
Yeah.
And thousands of people who were totally innocent of anything were executed.
Yeah.
They made quite a mess, and they were a couple of years cleaning up.
So in this period after Geneva, after Dien Bien Phu,
Yeah.
Ho Chi Minh is a figure that is a bit of he's not a mystery, but he's very interesting because he is a revolutionary, and then he is the father of the people, which is a lot of propaganda in there, and he's head of state. And then in this period afterwards, he's still kind of head of state, but there's also other figures kind of coming to the fore. And I can't quite figure out how much power Ho has in this government after the First War. Is he more of an advisor? Is he like a figurehead? Or is he just like a forward-facing kind of person for the government?
He's a member of a collective leadership. Communism often gets centralized in a single leader.
Mm-hmm.
Ho had never had the kind of personal domination that a lot of Communist Party heads have. He was a very important member of a collective leadership group in the 1950s and the early 1960s. And during the 1960s, Le Duan emerged as the dominant figure. Never, I think, as dominant as, say, Stalin or Mao, but more dominant than Ho had been.
Yeah.
I think, but by the end of the 1960s, Le Duan had a position of domination which was beyond anything that Ho had ever had.
When I read about him, he seems a bit more like the classic dictator sort of role, where he's incredibly hard, very ruthless, and effective. And I think I was reading a story where he married a woman and then, sent her away to China, like separated her from her children, sort of thing. Very interesting character, but absolutely terrifying personality.
Well, he was not a nice man. There were 2 types of backgrounds for communist leaders. There were the ones whose basic formative experience had been the schools they'd attended, and there were the ones whose basic formative experience had been the prisons where they'd served long prison terms under the French. And Le Duan was one of the latter group. Ho Chi Minh was one of the former group.
Yeah.
And the ones who talked to foreigners were all the ones who'd become communists through schools.
Yep.
The ones whose basic formative experience was long prison terms tended not to talk with foreigners.
So a bit of a shift here. This is, I guess, a bit more broadly speaking, but the United States goes into the Vietnam War with, by all accounts, if not the best military in the world, certainly if you're making a list, it's at the top of the list. They come out of the Vietnam War with a very, very, very different military. How does that happen when you're fighting what is perceived on the outside to be not an incredibly powerful country, and yet they are? The military goes in one way, comes out another way. For a lot of different reasons. But how does that happen in a conflict like this one?
I would say the big issue is demoralization. Soldiers don't like it when they think the country is not behind them. And during the period of the American withdrawal, it was obvious that the United States was not committed to victory. That's why they were withdrawing.
Right.
And this is not good for morale. It's a problem of shortage of good low-level leadership, the Army simply assumed that they never considered it might not happen. That when we decided to go into Vietnam in a big way, we'd call up a lot of reservists, the way we had done for Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the people who fought in Korea were the veterans of World War II, called back to service. You call up the reserves, you get a lot of sergeants.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, if you use the draft, all you get is privates.
Yeah.
And the sergeants are the glue that holds the Army together. You draft a lot of young men out of 60s culture, sex, drugs, rock and roll, and then you don't have enough sergeants to train them and discipline them. This is a recipe for very serious problems, such as widespread drug use. It doesn't help anything. You draft young men out of 60s culture in the United States and then send them to where most of the world's narcotics come from the neighborhood where you've sent them. The stuff is so cheap it's almost free there. And young men who've been accustomed to paying very high prices for crap on the streets of American cities, suddenly there's good stuff, and it's almost free. And you would need a lot of good sergeants to stop this from going in the obvious direction. And they didn't have enough good sergeants. Norman Schwarzkopf, the guy who commanded Operation Desert Storm against the Iraqis, he'd been given a battalion command in Vietnam. During this period, he said it almost destroyed his career. It was a lousy battalion, and it was utterly impossible to turn it into a good battalion because nothing the commanding officer does can do the job unless you have enough good sergeants. And he didn't have enough good sergeants, and it almost destroyed his career. And Schwarzkopf was good. There was a reason he ended up with 4 stars. But he wasn't good enough to make a bad battalion a good battalion without a lot of help from the good sergeants.
Interesting. Maybe I'm overstating this, but how much does the kind of self-perception after World War II infiltrate how the United States feels about how things are going to go in Vietnam?
Well, we assume that we can win any such struggle. The Vietnamese communists were extraordinarily strong. It was remarkably bad luck for the United States that we came up in a fairly poor, unsophisticated country against an enemy that strong, which it did not occur to us. Another part of it, simply, we were the world's dominant power. We were dominating the world in a way that nobody in the past had ever dominated. No, there had never been a world's dominant power like the United States, which meant we had our finger in almost every pie all around the world, which meant we were dealing with countries that we didn't know much about. Any normal country only fights wars in places it knows something about.
Mm-hmm.
The United States, as the world's dominant power, felt obliged to involve itself in places of which it was ignorant. Hardly anybody in the United States knew Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
Any normal country fighting a normal war in a place it knew something about, a bunch of people knew the language, and it would sort of naturally think, we need people who know the language. It didn't occur to the Americans we needed to have people who knew Vietnamese. This is an ongoing problem for the United States. When Paul Bremer was made ruler of Iraq in 2003, when we conquered Iraq, Bremer thought to himself, hey, I should have a close personal advisor who knows the language.
Right.
Somebody I deal with every day who can talk to the Iraqis in their own language. And he found somebody. And when Ray Odierno was made commander of the U.S. forces in Iraq, he said to himself, I need to have a close personal advisor who knows the language. And he found one. So far as I know, the question never occurred to General Westmoreland that it might be desirable to have a close personal advisor. He could have found one.
Yeah.
If he wanted one. I don't think it occurred to him that he needed one.
Do you think the perception of the South Vietnamese government was so low that it was almost like we don't need them to execute our aims in this war? We kind of, obviously they're not going to go away, but was it viewed like, yeah, it's real bad, but do we even need them to do what we want to do?
I think we always knew we needed them to do what we wanted them to do. I think we had this arrogant assumption that we understood the situation well enough that what we wanted them to do was what needed doing. You had Americans thinking they knew what needed to be done in Vietnam. That was what made New so annoying. He was unwilling even to be polite.
Yeah.
And people who thought they understood Vietnam better than he did told him what he should be doing. Later ones were more polite about it. We thought we knew what needed to be done, and we didn't know much about the country.
Yeah. Was there an attack on in the Tonkin Gulf?
You need to distinguish incidents. There are two Tonkin Gulf incidents. If you were going to pick one and call it the Tonkin Gulf incident, there'd be a case to be made for either one.
Yeah.
But in the first Tonkin Gulf incident, 3 torpedo boats attacked a U.S. destroyer. And in the second Tonkin Gulf incident, 2 U.S. destroyers fired their 5-inch guns at empty ocean. I believe it probably started with seabirds. I think there are certain, I'm not a radar expert, but I think there are certain conditions of temperature and humidity when the air will allow radar waves to bounce off birds in flight, giving you a sharper, clearer radar echo than you would usually get.
Interesting.
And I think it started with probably seabirds. And after that, I've talked with a pilot who thinks that his plane was one of the PT boats, showing on the destroyer's radar, you dip down low enough, you pass through the beams of the radar. You're looking for the PT boat, so you got low enough so you get seen by the radar, and your plane then gets identified as the PT boat,
Right.
for which you were searching. I am sure that some of what happened, you open fire, and your first shell goes out and detonates, and the detonating shell throws a spout of water into the air, which creates a great big clear image on the radar. And then you keep on firing at your own shell splashes from your previous shots.
Yeah.
And you can keep a radar target as long as you're willing to keep on firing at it.
Yeah.
I am confident there was nobody in the neighborhood but Americans.
So then Congress passes the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which is a bit different than a declaration of war. What are the differences between what Congress does with this resolution and what a declaration of war would have done?
Some of the aspects of this, I am out of step. There are differences I see between the resolution like that and a declaration of war that are not seen by the people whose opinions matter. And my appointment as God somehow got lost in the mail. So my opinions are not that relevant. But aside from that, the difference is that a resolution like that gives the president the ability to go to war if it feels like it. If he feels like it. It does not simply say, we're going to war. And that affects the politics of the decision making. You have I'm not sure I understand the third, but at any rate, you have 1964, Lyndon Johnson says, you need to give me the ability to go to war if I feel like it, but I'm not going to feel like it. You do not need to worry about me cashing this blank check you're giving me. That kicked back on him politically, badly, when people figured out that he'd been deceiving them about his plans. When he got them to give him a blank check and made them think he had no intention of cashing it when in fact he was expecting probably to cash it. Wait a few decades, you have the first President Bush doing what, as far as I am concerned, a brilliant job, looking like he was less enthusiastic about war than he actually was, and getting the Congress to give him a blank check, go to war if you think it necessary, but not telling any flaming lies, not misrepresenting his decision-making enough so that people are going to feel lied and deceived
Right.
when it all comes out in the wash, so it never kicked back against him politically, even though he managed to get him to think he was a little less interested in war than he really was.
Yeah.
And then his son goes through the motions of pretending he was not going to cash the blank check, but he never bothered to make it convincing enough that anybody really had a right to complain. If you didn't understand that he was planning on going to war, it's because you were under some pretty heavy medication
Right.
and your brain wasn't working right. So nobody had a right to complain,
Right.
even though he'd gone through the motions of pretending that he was not eager to cash the blank check.
Right.
And we have 3 different processes in 3 different incidents.
Interesting. So do you think it's Johnson's like conservatism about entering a war that leads him to represent himself as if he's not going to cash the blank check?
Well,
Is it
he desperately wished it were true.
okay?
He really did not want to cash the blank check because the war was going to be expensive, and he hated the idea of spending a lot of money on the military.
Yeah.
But he was expecting that, well, he was desperately hoping to think of a way to get out of it. He was not expecting to think of a way to get out of it. He thought he was probably going to war. And one of the reasons he sounded so convincing when he talked about not going to war was that he so desperately wished it were true.
I was reading Karl Marlantes, and he's talking about how the war kind of adopts this sort of spreadsheet quality where, you know, you're looking at it like we killed more of them than they killed of us. We must be doing pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
How does that sort of change how a war gets conducted when you're looking at it a bit more in the balance sheet?
Essentially, the problem was in 1946, during the last stages of the sliding down the slope into war between Ho Chi Minh and the French. One of the last meetings Ho Chi Minh had with a senior French official in the negotiations that were failing to produce a compromise that would avert war. Ho Chi Minh told the Frenchman, in this war that is coming, you will kill 10 of us for every one of you that we kill, and you will get tired of it first.
Yep.
The Vietnamese were willing to lose 10 for 1. And the Americans, I think, were killing 10 for 1. We got tired of it first.
Yeah. Yep. What was the analogy? Was the tiger and the elephant? I can't remember exactly how he put it, but yeah. I have seen it attributed to the fact that some of the people that Kennedy brought in are looking at the war in more of a balance sheet sort of perspective. If we do fill in the blank thing, and it looks good on paper, that means we're winning. Is that sort of different than how things would have been conducted in a different war in Korea, for example, or in World War II, for example? I guess why is that done, and how does that come together?
In Korea, we were able to clear enemy forces out of South Korea, and we ended up with a South Korea under anti-communist control. In Vietnam, we were unable to clear communist forces out of South Vietnam. Our goal was to achieve the same thing we'd achieved in Korea, a divided country with half of it under control of our side. We'd been able to do it in Korea, and we were unable to do it in Vietnam. It was bad luck being up against an extraordinarily strong opponent
Yeah.
who was willing to feed young men into the meat grinder
Right.
until we got tired of turning the crank.
When we're fighting there, we are fighting people that do not look like your typical Western army. You're not having ginormous field battles and things like this. But like part of that, the saying comes out, you're fighting people in black pajamas,
Yeah.
where everybody sort of looks the same. I wonder, and tell me if I'm overreaching here, I wonder if some of the more unfortunate stuff like My Lai, is that a result of something completely different than not being able to differentiate friend from foe? Is that, a few bad apples going off the handle per se, or is it we can't figure out who we're even fighting, kill everything that moves?
Well, My Lai was an enemy village. You could pretty well assume that the men were Viet Cong and that the women were supporters of Viet Cong. It wasn't particularly a problem of having trouble knowing what you're dealing with. I think the Americans were pretty clear. The guys are enemy soldiers, and the women and children are the wives and children and sisters of enemy soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And this was easy enough to understand. And the problem was that the enemy soldiers were good enough at concealment that you had trouble finding them when they didn't want to be found. They were told, we've located them. You can go into this village and it'll be full of enemy soldiers, and you finally get the fight you've been wanting.
Right.
And the intelligence information was bad, and it was not full of enemy soldiers. And it was peculiarities. Most American units would not have flipped out the way this unit did under those circumstances. And I don't think bad apples is the right way to describe it, but a number of men in the unit who were serial rapists, and you had a platoon commander was willing to be more ruthlessly murderous than was normal.
This is, I guess, even further digging in on that, you get a lot of engagements where the Viet Cong will make contact with U.S. soldiers. U.S. soldiers don't necessarily get to make that same contact on Viet Cong, which I'm assuming is incredibly taxing if you're fighting.
Well, bear in mind, we were killing more of them than they were killing of us. They tried to catch us by surprise anytime they could, try and get themselves in a situation where they're opening fire at Americans who were not expecting it at that time and place. If you've managed to set it up right, you can achieve very good result. And if you haven't, you can hope to run for it once the Americans get their act together. And the fact that the Americans are so much better armed than you are means that it is a lot harder to get away when you run for it.
Yeah.
Than it would be against people who are less heavily armed. And the Americans' capabilities, and I don't even know how well some of this stuff worked. A standard procedure, you set up a mortar a mile or two away from the Americans. You fire mortar shells at the Americans. And then you dismantle your mortars and carry them away. One of the possibilities was that the American artillery fire would fall on you almost instantaneously because the Americans were tracking the mortar shells by radar. And if the Americans have got their communication system working well, you could tell the artillery, these are the coordinates from which the mortar shells are coming, and have American counterfire landing on those coordinates almost immediately after the mortar's fired. And I simply don't know how well it worked. How often the Americans had everything, all the pieces of the system fitting together the way they were supposed to, so you could really put counterfire on the location for which the mortar fire came.
Right.
Near instantaneously. But this kind of situation was why, even when the communists are working hard, do it by surprise.
Right.
They don't always survive.
Right.
Doing it by surprise.
There's a ton of lasting impacts from this whole conflict in like a million different ways. But what are some of the overarching things? Because I think it's like an inflection point kind of thing where things do shift a lot. But how are things kind of changing after this?
Well, let's see. You have the American disinclination to casualties, greatly accentuated. Already had a tradition of using firepower to hold down the amount of blood you had to spend. And that gets greatly strengthened, and in effect, the United States becomes unwilling to operate in ways that were going to lead to heavy American casualties. We had a lot better reason to go into Afghanistan than we did to go into Vietnam. I think the total number of Americans killed by hostile action in the whole length of the Afghan war would certainly be less than the number for one bad month in Vietnam.
Yeah.
A lot of this is simply we became willing to notice. Vietnam was not important to the United States. The notion that this was a place that was important where we had to fight, because if we didn't fight, something very bad for the United States would happen.
Right.
This was delusional. If we have a situation come up, and I'm not actually expecting one in my lifetime, but we could easily have one in your lifetime, in which there is actually something important at stake. And then we will see whether it's relatively easy to get the United States. We're not willing to get a lot of men killed for something of no genuine importance.
Yeah.
What will happen if there is something that is of genuine importance? Will the aversion to casualties then have a crippling effect on a war that there's actually some good reason to fight?
That aversion to casualties, is that an American kind of approach related to how the war is being reported on and public opinion of that war being related to the casualties from it? Or is that just sort of a long-standing kind of thing?
A lot of it is, bear in mind, the United States gets in wars only on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
No American war has anything to do with anything happening in our neighborhood.
Right.
And depending on how you want to count it, I think the last time, if you want to call it a war, the last time the United States fought a war that was actually local was when Pancho Villa came across the border into Texas.
Yeah. I was thinking Civil War, but yeah, you're right.
Yeah, and if you want to call Pancho Villa a military leader and call the operation against him a war, you can say that only a little more than 100 years ago,
the
United States fought a war which was actually in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
If something actually comes up that is in our neighborhood, it'll be very interesting to see if the Americans are willing to suffer casualties for something that is actually in our neighborhood.
It's interesting you bring up neighborhood, because when you've got like this burgeoning nuclear age that gets paired along with this whole thing, where you almost up the stakes even further, you could do serious damage to another country in like 6 minutes or something. And so the neighborhood kind of expands in a way where you're right. very far across the world, but you've also got this new nuclear technology where you don't
Yeah.
fully understand it. You don't know when and how and whatever you should
Yeah.
use it, but it's obviously a huge thing. And like you get in, you get into this standoff with other powers that have the
Yeah.
same technology, and it does kind of expand things a little bit.
There's still the question of, is it in the neighborhood? If Mexico had nukes, that would be a different thing.
Right. One last question for you.
Yeah.
Going back to kind of the 1940s onward, I read that the communists in Vietnam are an archipelago where they're here, but their range of
That's
influence
Chris
is,
Gosta's term.
yeah. I love that term because it describes it
Well,
so well.
and Gostra is, I think of as the top historian of Vietnam in his generation. In the generation before him, it was David Marr. But Chris Gostra has been the inheritor of the position in the next generation.
Yeah, it's such a simple thing just to say it's an archipelago, but it describes it, I think, so well because you have spheres of influence that are connected, but they are still somewhat disconnected. Then, obviously, after you have that division of the 17th parallel, things get a little bit more put together. But like, how does that change? Obviously, things change once you get that division and once they are like a unified government above the 17th parallel. But how does this kind of change from it's a very fledgling thing in the first war in Indochina to a very, very organized and, as you say, very powerful thing in the 60s? But like, how does that all kind of happen?
It was pretty organized. That was one of the things the Communist Party turned out to be good for, maintaining enough cohesion that people who were widely separated functioned as members of a group and did not become rivals. The Chinese Communist Party had been like that, and they were able to function as an archipelago for portions of the 1940s where Chairman Mao did not need to worry that other communist commanders who were on the far side of Chiang Kai-shek's army, so in effect, an archipelago state, were not going to remain in the ways that really mattered, part of his organization. And you had the same archipelago state in, when Chris Gostra describes it, in the First Indochina War. In the Second Indochina War, more unity of command. Biggest communist headquarters, the South, generally had somebody sent south from Hanoi to run it, even though that person might well have been born in the South. The communist leadership was not a North Vietnamese communist leadership. It was not it was a communist leadership. But mostly, if you were near the top, you were near headquarters in Hanoi, and somebody would be sent down there to run the headquarters in the South. And incidentally, being head of the headquarters in the South was the best possible stepping stone toward being head of the whole Communist Party, North and South.
Yeah.
And I think there was a period of 30 years in which the head of the Communist Party in Hanoi was always a former head of the headquarters in the South.
Interesting. I mean, you get to prove your mettle a little bit if you're head of the South.
Being sent south to run the headquarters in the South was not a sign that your career was in trouble.
That's a sign that we think this person's competent. They're going to do a good job. You're going to go. You're going to go make a mess down there.
The biggest case I know of, which was really not very big, of indiscipline in the Second Indochina War, where people were playing fast and loose with policies they were being given from Hanoi, was in the southernmost part of South Vietnam, down south of Saigon.
Yeah.
And the fact they were a long way from Hanoi might have
had something to do with it.
Might have had something to do with it.
That's all I've got. Thank you so much for coming on. This was an absolute joy. Thank you so much. His name is Professor Edwin Moise. You can find his books on Amazon. I'll have links below in the description where you can find his work. Another thing, too, and this is, I think, one of the godsends for me researching this whole subject, Professor Moise has the most extensive bibliography about the Vietnam War that I have come across in my research for this entire thing. You can search Edwin Moise bibliography online, and it will come up for you. There are hundreds of books on there. So, dude is an authority on the Vietnam War, and this was an absolute treat for me to get to speak with him. Check out that bibliography if you want to find some stuff to dive into and research this subject a little bit deeper. And if you haven't gone and checked out Hell in a Small Place episodes 1, 2, and 3, please go give those a listen as well. Again, thank you so much, everybody who listens, watches, leaves ratings and reviews, sends me kind messages. All of those things are greatly, greatly appreciated. Have a good one, everybody. I will see you in the next show.